needs no introduction. George Galloway is a British politician, broadcaster, and writer. Between 2012 and 2015, he was the Respect Party MP for Bradford West, after previously serving as an MP for 23 years for both Labour and Respect. Galloway was described by The Guardian in 2005 as being renowned for his colourful rhetoric and debating style. The Spectator awarded him Debater of the Year in 2001. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming George Galloway to the Cambridge Union.
Thank you. This is a soft seat.
That's good. So I wanted to start off the discussion by talking to you a little bit about the Labour Party and about Jeremy Corbyn. So obviously you were expelled from the Labour Party in 2003, and the Labour Party is now under new leadership and what many describe as a radical change in the approach to the party. How far do you think Mr. Corbyn is going to change the Labour Party and British politics? And looking back at your time as a Labour MP, do you regret not being a part of the Labour Party at this time?
Well, the last point is easy to deal with. I never wanted to be out of the Labour Party. I joined it when I was 13 years old. I was expelled against my will. I spent a lot of money and a lot of time trying to avoid expulsion on lawyers and all the rest. At my expulsion hearing, Mr. Michael Foot, the previous leader of the party, Mr. Benn, the greatest Labour parliamentarian of all time, and Mr. Corbyn were my character witnesses, if you like, asking the National Executive not to expel me. So, of course, I regretted being expelled, but having been expelled, I wasn't going to, as it were, retire from the field. So I continued my battle in another form, and as you implied in your introduction, I did tell Mr. Blair on the day I was expelled that he would rue the day, and they lived to rue the day. First in 2005 in Bethnal Green and Bow, when I defeated Labour in a rock-solid seat, and then again in the by-election in 2012. But I spent nearly 30 years as a Member of Parliament, and of course I would have liked still to be a Labour MP. I think the title of Labour MP is something to be. Mm-hmm. I think that Jeremy Corbyn, whom I've been associated with for almost 40 years and sat literally next to in Parliament for most of my time as a member of the House of Commons, is a fantastic change. But he's in office rather than yet in power. Mm-hmm. In fact, we have dual power in the Labour Party today. We have the power of the members who elected Jeremy Corbyn and the power of the members of Parliament who are determined to wreck his leadership, which in the last couple of weeks has descended into a kind of rabble, popping up not daily but hourly, new, different, sometimes the same, members of Parliament seeking to wreck his leadership. It's not clear what the outcome of that dual power will be. You can't have two cooks in a kitchen, you can't have two leaders in the same party, you can't have dual power in a British political party. So this will have to be resolved one way or another. But it goes without saying that Jeremy Corbyn has my absolute loyalty and support and love, and I wish him every success.
I mean, drawing on from that, as you said, several key members of the Labour Party are trying to wreck Mr. Corbyn's leadership, and that is partly because, like several commentators, they believe him to be unelectable. Do you think that Mr. Corbyn's personal characteristics and policies render him unelectable?
I really don't, and it's odd that it comes from people who have themselves lost the last two elections. I mean, if there were wizards who had suddenly been usurped by someone who was less good than them at winning elections, that would be one thing. But the group around Miliband proved a miserable failure, and the group around Gordon Brown proved a miserable failure. So I'm not sure they're in the best position to lecture other people on what is or isn't electable. I think that Mr. Corbyn is this, a good and honest man. And I have known him for almost 40 years, 39 to be precise. I don't think anyone could credibly dispute that. He's a good and honest man. So is being a good and honest man unelectable? I doubt that. And if it is, what would we prefer? A bad, dishonest man? Would that be better? If that were held to be electable, what's the point in being elected? For bad intentions or dishonest purposes. So I have faith in the British people, and the contest when it comes, if God spares him, 2020, will be a very interesting one, and it will be a different one because David Cameron will have retired, and the Conservatives, having laid waste to the public services and proved even more divisive in their second term than they were able to be in their first, will be quite an enfeebled political force, I think. And their leader will either be George, or should I say Gideon Osborne, for that is his name, Gideon Osborne of the Bullingdon Club. I know that's a rival outfit to yours, but it's...
it just isn't, but okay.
But it describes him, I think. He's a pasty-faced product of the English ruling elite. And I don't think that cuts a lot of mustard in the country. Or, if there's a crash in 2018, which some predict there will be, the leader is likely to be Boris Johnson, also of Eton and the Bullingdon Club. I think Jeremy Corbyn against Boris Johnson, or Jeremy Corbyn against George Osborne, will be a much closer contest than the pundits would like you to believe here and now.
You obviously regret not being a part of the Labour Party, and perhaps this can be attributed over the past few years to your perhaps somewhat controversial comments on various issues, which obviously lots of people disagree with. And this brings me on to my next question, which is Julian Assange. As you're probably aware, this union voted recently and held a referendum on whether or not we would give a platform to Mr. Assange. And the overwhelming majority of our membership voted in favour, and Mr. Assange is scheduled to speak here by video link on the 11th of November. You came under intense fire from anti-rape campaigners over your comments in relation to the allegations that were levelled against Mr. Assange. And you said that they have no basis because having sex with a woman when she is asleep is not rape. You then defended these sexual allegations, assault allegations against Mr. Assange by stating that they amounted to no more than bad sexual etiquette. I just wanted to ask you a bit more about that, and to ask you how you feel justified in defending that position when the law in this country is very clear in noting that consent is required every time someone has sex.
Well, that last point is actually not the case. You're obviously not a law student.
I actually am. Okay.
You are? In that case, we've got problems. It is a defense against an accusation of rape that reasonable grounds to assume consent. That happens to be the law. Now, I want to start at first principles, if I may. I wasn't expelled for any of these things, not for any of these controversial positions. I was expelled over the war and nothing but the war. As Mr. Blair himself has now begun a very slow creep towards the recognition of the truth, and who knows, an apology of sorts may follow, at least to keep him out of jail. I don't think that my expulsion can any longer be tenable. All I did was say what has turned out to be true. And therefore, to not rescind my expulsion would be unjust. Forgive me being legalistic about that, but I get asked this question all the time, so I have to be very accurate in what I'm saying. Julian Assange should receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Julian Assange has performed a service to the world, to those of inquiring mind, as I presume all of you are, or you wouldn't be here, to every journalist in the world, to every broadcaster in the world. Julian Assange ought to be a hero. And the reason he's in this fix, and it is a fix, I can assure you, his situation in the Ecuador embassy in a single room for all these years now is a real fix. The reason that he's in this fix is nothing whatsoever to do with allegations, and they are only allegations, made after the fact, long after the fact, by women that he slept with in Sweden. They are everything to do with the determination of the United States of America to do to Julian Assange what they've done to Chelsea Manning, to get him in front of a secretly assembled grand jury and send him to prison for the rest of his life. This is not a small matter. Now, in support of that contention, I could make many arguments. I make only two. The first is that Assange, or three, Assange asked the Swedish authorities if he could leave Sweden when these allegations were first raised. And the Swedish authorities told him in writing that he could. The second is this, that it was open to the Swedish authorities to do what they have done on many, many occasions, including in murder cases, of going to a second country and interviewing someone suspected of a crime in the country in which they were. The Swedish authorities have refused to do that, without explanation as to why. And the third and most important of all is that Assange and his lawyers sought only a guarantee that Sweden would not extradite Assange to the United States of America to face trial for treason, though he's not an American citizen, on the WikiLeaks case. They have completely refused to give such an undertaking. So I'm asking any one of you if you would voluntarily go to Sweden, which has the closest possible relations with the United States, without a guarantee that they were not going to send you on to a secret grand jury in the United States, where you might be sentenced to up to 100 years in prison. Now, I believe in Assange. I believe in his good character. But I wasn't there, and neither were you, nor anyone here, when these events that have been much discussed took place or didn't take place. I regret the words that I used in sticking up for Julian Assange. I regret the fact that those words, the way that I expressed my position, have given my enemies opportunities to attack me and attack him. And I'm sorry that I upset some people, including some that I personally respect and know, that I gave them offense by the way in which I expressed my view. But my view doesn't change, that Assange is being set up so that he can be extradited to the United States. No means no in sexual affairs. Rape is a hideous crime that should be prosecuted and, if convicted, punished most severely. Rape is a hideous thing. But Julian Assange has never been charged with rape, has never been charged actually with any sexual offense, let alone convicted of one. And I'm therefore glad that the Cambridge students did what they should have done in the referendum in the last few days, and that Julian will be able to speak for himself to you on the 11th of November.
Drawing on from that, you obviously, as you said, regretted the way in which you tried to defend Mr. Assange, but as you yourself conceded, your comments have obviously angered and alienated several groups within the Respect Party and just more generally. Do you think, given your comments and given the fact that you are the leader of this party, that the Respect Party will be able to continue to attract women to be a part of it and engage with it?
Frankly, the only 2 times I've been asked anything about this issue in the last 2 years have both been at Cambridge University in the last 60 minutes.
Yes, well,
so I can assure you that on the streets of London, where I'm currently campaigning, absolutely nobody is asking me these questions.
Yes, but it's a very important question, given the fact that Mr. Assange is going to speak here soon.
It is a very important question.
Yes,
but
exactly why I'm asking it.
Julian will speak for himself. I just don't think if we've got a short meeting, we necessarily have to stick with this subject to the exclusion of others. But that's up to you.
Okay, moving on to the next topic then. In February 2013, you walked out of a debate in Oxford on the motion Israel should withdraw immediately from the West Bank when you found out that the opponent in the debate was Israeli. Do you regret doing that? And do you think it was right to refuse to talk to someone just because he was Israeli in that situation?
Well, I talk to Israelis all the time. In fact, one particular Israeli, perhaps the finest Israeli, I speak to almost every day. Professor Ilan Pape of now Exeter University, formerly professor of history at Haifa University, is an Israeli Jew with whom I work very closely. So it has nothing to do with the nationality of the person involved. I work with lots of Israelis. But my policy is no recognition, no normalization. So I cannot behave towards an Israeli supporter of the apartheid state in the way that I would deal with either an Israeli opponent of the apartheid state or a citizen of any other country. I spent, you might say, the best years of my life underground as an agent of the African National Congress. I was one of the very few people on the left in Britain who was able to travel the length and breadth of apartheid South Africa, working underground for the ANC. And by the way, every single person that facilitated my work was a Jew. South African Jews were amongst the greatest heroes of the anti-apartheid struggle. I could run through their names, but we're short of time. Therefore, the issue of apartheid is deeply important to me. I would not, during the period of South African apartheid, have debated with, for the entertainment of a student audience or anywhere else, an advocate of, a supporter of apartheid in South Africa. And therefore, I cannot do so with an advocate and supporter of apartheid in Palestine. So it's really not rocket science. It's nothing to do with religion. I'm working with Jewish and Israeli comrades of mine all the time. It's everything to do with where that person or that institution stands in relation to the apartheid state. Now, I'm not denying them a platform. They can debate with anyone else. They can and do have many platforms on which to speak, but not with me, because my position is fixed on the experiences I had as an opponent of, an enemy of apartheid in South Africa.
World leaders, I mean, drawing on from that, world leaders and international organizations have often said that the only way to resolve the Israel-Palestine crisis is through dialogue and discussion and cooperation.
That's going well, isn't it?
Your attitude of non-recognition and non-engagement almost in certain instances, do you really think that this will help solve the problem? And what do you see as the big advantages?
My dear, I'm not going to solve the Israel-Palestine question.
No, but your approach.
I'm just a humble agitator, just a soldier, that's all.
Okay.
That's all. If the Israelis want to speak to the Palestinians, their address is the PLO, and they should. But if they won't, don't ask me to speak instead. I'm an agitator trying to persuade people of the rights and wrongs on this subject. That's all. And my position is crystal clear. I supported the Oslo Agreement because I was very close to the late President Arafat for most of my life and until the last day of his. I was at his bedside when he died in Paris. And I supported the Oslo Agreement because he persuaded me that the talk of the Oslo process had produced something. Well, we now know that it produced not only nothing, but even worse than nothing. It's 20 years since the Oslo Agreement, and not 1 centimeter of Palestine is free. Not 1 centimeter of the land or the airspace on or above Palestine is free. So that's not working. My stand is I will not recognize a state based on the destruction of another country, of another people. And that's a deliberate allusion to Professor Einstein, who said, when asked if he would be the president, the first president of Israel, that I cannot be the president of a state that is built on the ruin of another people. And that's what Israel is. Somebody said to me in Parliament last year that, well, Israel lives in a tough neighborhood. And I replied that the problem is that Israel's living on top of somebody else's neighborhood. It's not that it's a tough neighborhood, it's that it's somebody else's neighborhood that they are living on top of. So I promised 40 years ago, I promised an audience of Palestinian refugees that as long as God gave me breath, I would never stop advocating their right to return home to their land, their houses, their country. That's all I try to do.
Moving on to some of the comments you made in 2006 when, in relation to Hezbollah, you said that they were not a terrorist organization, and in 2008, the UK decided to class Hezbollah's military wing as a terrorist organization. Do you make a distinction between Hezbollah's political and military wings, or do you still maintain that the entire organization is not a terrorist organization?
How much of a charge sheet have you assembled here?
Well, it's not a charge sheet, it's just questions.
It feels a bit like a trial.
Well, it's not, it's questions.
Yeah. You know, there are some contemporary burning British issues that I really hope we have time to get on to.
We will get to them.
Hezbollah is a national liberation movement in Lebanon. It came into being to drive the illegal Israeli military occupation from their own country, from their own land. When Hitler stood at the Channel ports, Mr. Churchill promised that if the invader landed on our soil, we would fight them on the beaches, on the landing grounds, from house to house, and that we would never surrender. And he was right about that, and lives on in history forever because of that stand. The Lebanese are not less than us. They will not accept foreign invasion and occupation of their country any more than we would have been prepared to do so. And you can toss around this nomenclature of terrorism and so on. I can answer it by asking for your definition of terrorism and so on. But my stand is that Israel is a terrorist state. It lives by the terror that it inflicted on the native population of Palestine in 1948, when it drove 800,000 Palestinians out of their land, out of their houses, many of them into Lebanon, and has continued to live by terror ever since. It invaded and occupied almost one half, nearly 40% actually, of Lebanon for decades, and Hezbollah chased them out of most of Lebanon, but not yet all of it. The solution, if there is one, to these conflicts, now becoming ancient conflicts, will have to be resolved there in the region. The rest of us have a choice. Are we with the European colonizers, or are we with their victims? I'm with their victims.
Okay. You obviously have been involved in politics for a long time, and Cambridge is quite an active political community and political university, with lots of political parties having student societies here. Obviously, looking at Westminster politics and looking at it from the angle of a student, lots of people are often disenchanted by Prime Minister's questions and the way that MPs behave in Parliament. What do you think is the single biggest issue in relation to the way Parliament is conducted that needs to be addressed immediately?
Well, I think Jeremy Corbyn has made a start on that with the new approach that he's taken to Prime Minister's question time, which is, frankly, an absurdity. Please don't take this personally. It flows from the kind of atmosphere that sometimes, not here, happens in the Oxford and Cambridge student unions, of people playing games, yawing and booing, kind of Punch and Judy politics, with no one really believing very much in what it is they're saying or what the other person's saying. They could change around in the best traditions of a debating society and argue the precise opposite with just the same synthetic passion. That's no way to run a railroad. It's no way to run a country. It's no way to subject the executive to the kind of forensic parliamentary scrutiny that a real parliament would do. And Jeremy Corbyn has begun to do that, and I think you can notice the difference, and I hope that it will turn out to be more popular than the Punch and Judy affair that I lived in Parliament through for all that time. We need, frankly, half as many MPs as we've got. We need to pay them twice as much as we pay them, and we need to give each Member of Parliament power, and each Member of Parliament a cadre of staff, so that the professionalism of the average British Member of Parliament can be greatly improved. Most Members of Parliament are frankly just making up the numbers. They rarely speak. When they speak, it's rarely memorable, and frankly, they do what they're told, most of them. It was not ever thus, but it has been for the last 20 years or so, in my experience, more and more the case. So I'd, if I could, make many, many changes in the British parliamentary system. In this current digital age, there can be no excuse for forcing people to physically present themselves in a school on a rainy Thursday in order to cast their vote. People ought to be able to cast their vote for elections electronically, and if you can do bank transactions involving huge sums of money electronically, you can cast your vote electronically, and over not one day, but perhaps over a whole weekend. And people could be consulted via direct democracy, digitally, far more easily than it ever seemed possible, and we should progress towards that. If I'm the Mayor of London, I will erect something called the blockchain, where everyone can see in real time exactly what the budget is, exactly what it's being spent on, and can make direct suggestions as to better ways of spending that £17.5 billion budget. And they will be, if I'm the Mayor, increasingly asked to give their view on what should happen by direct democracy. More powerful select committees that are elected by secret ballot. I was, I think, 28 years in the British Parliament, but never got a seat on a select committee. because the select committees are chosen by the whips, and the whips never liked me. Even though I had some expertise in foreign affairs, for example, or in Scottish affairs, I would never have had a chance of being on the select committee and making a contribution that way. I think that kind of gerrymandering has to stop. The select committees have to be secretly elected democratically by the members of the House, and the select committees must have more power and more stage time, if you like, television time, than they currently do.
Talking about the digital age and the way it has affected the way that MPs interact with their constituents, obviously there are kind of two sides to this coin. It allows MPs to communicate with their constituents better, but on the other hand, say a comment that you made, perhaps something that was controversial, could go viral, and perhaps sometimes those comments could be taken out of context, but still significantly harm your reputation because of the way the digital media works. So I suppose my question is, how do you think those who are involved in politics and anyone who is interested in going into politics should navigate working in that environment where the digital media exists and is able to disseminate whatever you say so quickly?
Well, I also support the bill introduced into Parliament by my mayoral opponent, Zach Goldsmith, of the right of recall of members of Parliament. Members of one's constituency ought to be able, if they disapprove of a stand being taken by their member of Parliament, to trigger a series of events that would lead to a referendum in that constituency as to whether the member of Parliament should continue or not. I'm and have always been, even when I was in the Labour Party, in a luxurious position that I don't really care whether I'm a member of Parliament or not. I don't see it as a career. I stand by what I believe in. I obey my conscience. Even if I was the last man standing who believed what I was saying, I'd still say it. Whether it led to defeat or victory is a secondary matter. I think if you're going to have a parliament worthy of the name, you must be confident that those who are sitting in it are saying what they really mean and meaning what they say. And that was once true. When I entered Parliament in 1987, there were 100 or more easily identifiable members of Parliament from both sides, all sides, who, if they stood up to say something, you could be confident that they really meant what they were saying. Now we have a Parliament where people are actually given their speeches into their hands before they go into the Parliament by someone else. They're told, I mean, I recall vividly a small vignette, a member of Parliament called David Winnick, not by any means one of the worst members of Parliament, not at all. He said in the debate, I was there, said in the debate over whether we should have identity cards, he said, Mr. Speaker, if this was a free vote tonight, this measure would fall. Now, that was a statement of fact, but it was a very telling self-criticism if he'd paused. Because what he was really saying was, I'm going to vote against what I think is right, because someone else told me to. Now, if the Parliament is going to be the apex of the democratic system, it must be true, surely, that members of Parliament will neither speak or vote against that which they think is correct. And we'd have a better Parliament if we had one like that.
I mean, what you're trying to essentially get to, I think, is the importance of politicians maintaining their integrity.
Yep.
You have obviously attracted a lot of criticism from the left and the right and everywhere for your comments in relation to the government of Iran and your work for the state-run satellite television channel Press TV. Now, you have consistently supported equality legislation in the UK, yet you continue to work for a TV channel that is run by a country, and you have worked for some time for a TV channel that is run by a country which continues to actively persecute homosexual and transgender people. How do you reconcile your stance on LGBT rights, LGBT plus rights, with your ability to work for the Iranian state TV?
Well, 4 times you said state TV. You do know that the BBC is the British state TV. If the BBC asked me to have a show on the BBC, I would of course accept it, on the proviso that nobody told me what to say or what not to say. And that's what I do on Press TV. It's what I do with my wife on RT, on Russia Today. We have a weekly show there. No one has ever, would ever, and if they did, it would be the end, ever asked me, told me what to say and what not to say. So frankly, I'll take a television platform on any television station, even Fox News. No, I mean that. As long as Fox News didn't try to tell me what to say and what not to say. Even on your Cambridge TV that I had a most unsatisfactory interview with 1 hour ago. Because I'm in charge of what I say and what I do. I'm not responsible for what other people say and what they do. If your charge was that I had somehow compromised my own views on gay rights, then that would be a very serious charge. But as you acknowledge in your preface, that's not true. I have a Stonewall Award for being, at the time, one of the few members of Parliament who stood up for equality when it was a very small minority of members of Parliament. I have an unimpeachable record, I think, on the rights of gay and lesbian people, transgender people, and that goes for whether I'm working for RT or Press TV or not. So Iran is a country, a great country, a very powerful and important country, a significant country, as is being recognized now that the sanctions are coming to an end and the new international dispensation with Iran is in sight. It's within days, in fact, of an end to the sanctions and so on. I hope that Iran will develop in the right way and that more rather than less exposure to discussions like this one that we're having now will have a positive effect. You can be sure that when hangings, for example, are declared imminent, I publicly and privately denounce, because I'm against capital punishment for anybody, anywhere, at any time, for any subject. So I have been asked many times to get involved in lobbying Iran to try and save the lives of people who are being judicially murdered by their judicial system, just like is happening in the United States most days, or happens in Saudi Arabia every day. I do lobby, but I also publicly speak out on Twitter and elsewhere.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for answering my questions so comprehensively. I'm sure that there are so many people here who have several questions for you, and since we are short for time, I'm going to open the event to the floor. If you have questions for Mr. Galloway, please raise your hand. Please wait for a microphone to reach you, and I do ask that you keep your questions as brief as possible so we can cover a good cross-section of the room. Yes, gentleman at the back. That's you. Yes.
Thank you. Douglas Morrison, Christ's. Mr. Galloway, you caused me to channel, if I can have the arrogance to do that, W.H. Auden. When I hear you speak, I think the ogre stands with hands on hips while drivel gushes from his lips.
Thank you.
Oh, not at all. I mean, it's criticism of your old pals in the Soviet Union when they invaded Czechoslovakia, and I know how badly you felt when they were overthrown in 1989, so obviously we've got huge pity for you on that. But it's interesting you mentioned Press TV, because while you were prostituting yourself for the mullahs in Iran on that channel
This is
a couple of years ago, Mr. Galloway, you've had your fun. It's my turn now, so shut up.
Okay.
You apologise.
Okay. It's fine for you to ask your question, but I'm going to please ask that you allow Mr. Galloway to respond and to please ask your question in a very rational way, if that's okay. So, go on.
May I continue?
But do politely. Yes.
All right, no problem. Oh, well, that's by and by now. That's done. Speaking of things that Mr. Galloway has said, you said on Press TV a couple of years ago that North Korea, while you wouldn't live there, which to your credit you said, is in some ways a pristine society. You even said it was an innocent society just because it's free of American influence. And you said that you were more scared of the United States than North Korea. Now, I think, Mr. Galloway, that I'm impressed with your rates at which you hire yourself out to these regimes. But I believe in giving people a second chance. So if you would like to recant that in front not only of this audience in here, but of all the people watching on the internet, then you're welcome to do so. Thank you.
Well, that was just a stream of ad hominem personal abuse. That was one insult after another, one distortion after another, one quote taken out of context after another. So candidly, I don't regard your question as worthy of my response.
Next question. Yes, at the back, Michael.
Matt Storer, Emmanuel. Whilst I understand both of your positions on Israel and on Iran State TV, do you not think that you're contradicting yourselves in taking this position of not talking to Israelis at all, whilst taking this platform on Iranian TV, where apartheid kind of towards women exists?
Actually, apartheid towards women in Iran is, to a very, very considerable degree, much less than apartheid towards women in Saudi Arabia, which is Britain's closest friend in the Middle East, according to David Cameron, according to Prince Charles, according to most British prime ministers. So I think you may be overstating the point about the role of women in Iran. Iran is an Islamic country. It had an Islamic revolution. It conducts its affairs according to what they think are Islamic norms, and they have every right to do so. I wouldn't tolerate Iran telling the Cambridge Union how to organize its affairs, and I am not sure that, however eminent your college, you're qualified to lecture Iran on how it organizes its. The principal difference between Iran and Israel is that Iran is not living on top of someone else. Iran is not living in someone else's country. Iran has not invaded any other country for 300 years. I wish we could say the same. I wish we could say the same for the last 300 days. Iran is a society in change. It's a very young country. Half of its people are under the age of 25. Most of those have therefore known nothing other than enmity from Western countries who have consistently sought to interfere in their lives. I'm sure you know that Iran once had, in 1953, a democratic, Labour, socialist government under Dr. Mossadegh, who was elected as the leader of Iran and overthrown by Britain. Britain and the United States, with in this case, Britain playing the leading role. He was overthrown, imprisoned, and the Shah of Persia, the worst tyrant of them all, was reinstated onto the peacock throne, and many decades of the most extraordinary repression took place, which made certain that the revolution led by Ayatollah Khomeini would eventually overthrow it and come to power. So, I suppose what I'm saying is Britain is the last country in the whole world that should be lecturing the Iranians on how they operate. If Iran was occupying somebody else's territory, if Iran had driven out what is now more than 10 million Palestinian people, then I would have the same attitude to them as I do towards Israel. But as they didn't, I don't.
Thank you. Next question. Yes, in the front.
Jonathan Davis, Christ, Emmanuel even. Mr. Galloway, you said today that it's very important that politicians stick by their integrity. They have integrity, they stick by their convictions. And you also said that when you arrived at the debate at the Oxford Union a couple of years ago and found out who you were debating, that you wouldn't give them any engagement. I'm wondering, when you went to a debate on whether Israel should withdraw from Gaza, when you went to that debate, what were you expecting to find? Because it seems to me that it perhaps was the nationality of the man there and not his convictions that caused you to leave.
Not at all.
If someone believes with integrity what they're going to debate, who were you expecting to find?
I was expecting...
why did you leave?
I was expecting to debate against a supporter of Israel. I do that every day. I do it on radio, on television, on Twitter, on Facebook, on public platforms, in the street. I have no problem about debating against people who support Israel. I have no problem about working with Israelis who are against the apartheid state. My problem is affording recognition to Israeli supporters of apartheid. You're an intelligent audience. You must be able to discern the difference between these categories. So I went to the debate believing that I'd be debating against a supporter of Israel. When I discovered that I was debating against an Israeli supporter of apartheid, of military age, who I now realize, I now know, served in the Israeli military, I have no intention of affording recognition with to such people, any more than I would have done with a Boer supporting apartheid in South Africa. I'm not sure why you're fixated on this. There are plenty of other people that he could debate with, just not with me.
Next question. Yes, at the back.
Hi, Callum, Queen's College. You campaigned against Scottish independence, so I was just wondering what you thought about the possibility of any future Scottish independence referendum.
I'm very worried about it. I did campaign hard and long against breaking up this small country of English-speaking people because I believed that it would be against the interests of both the Scots and everyone else on this island, and because I'm generally not in favour of breaking up countries anyway unless there is no alternative to it, and in most cases there is. I spent many months crisscrossing Scotland, speaking at big meetings, trying to persuade Labour voters in the main to remain solid behind the unity of the Scottish and English people. And we won, but we didn't win by much. And then two things happened that may have changed the balance. The first was in the early hours of that first morning, hours after the result was announced, David Cameron appeared on the steps of Downing Street and made a wildly provocative series of statements which he has now put into the legislative process and which was voted on just last week, I think. So-called evil English votes for English members only being allowed to vote on English legislation. This was wildly provocative, rendering at a stroke the Scottish electorate and Scottish members of Parliament to second-class status, and has been a big boon to the Scottish nationalists. The second was the defeat of Labour in 2015, in May of 2015. After all, my pitch to the voters was, hang on, the Tories will be out, and we'll have a Labour government, which will not be a perfect one by any means, but will be much better than what any Tory government could be. And that too turned out to be false, because Miliband lost the election. The Tories are back with a majority, and 4.5 years of attrition and austerity stretching out in front of us. So, truthfully, if there was a new referendum now, I wouldn't be at all confident that we could win it. I would still campaign for a no vote. I'd still campaign against breaking up this small country in a small world. But I wouldn't be at all confident that we would prevail, which is why I hope that sanity within the Conservative Party, if there is any, will prevail, and that further provocations, which only assist the separatists, are not mounted from Westminster.
Thank you. Next question. Yes, at the back.
Hello, my name's Zach, and I'm from Jesus College. I have two very quick questions. We've heard a lot about George Galloway's political views. I was wondering if I could ask you about your religious views. You've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. You said you were friends with Yasser Arafat. I'm really wondering what you think of the religious motivations that he had. You know, Islam's an inherently political religion, whether you're moderate or Islamist. So I'd be interested to know that. The second question is about the Scottish Labour's plans for more autonomy and where you see that going, because it seems to me like Jeremy Corbyn still doesn't really get what's happening in Scotland for both unionist Scots and nationalist Scots. What do you think of that?
Well, Yasser Arafat was the leader of a secular movement within the Palestinian movement. Fatah is not Hamas, was not Hamas. Although Arafat was himself quite a strong believer, he did not conduct politics on an Islamist basis. That's why Israel helped Hamas to get off the ground. Israel, in a sense, invented Hamas. They certainly facilitated it, and I was there and saw it happening with my own eyes, because they wanted to divide the Palestinian movement. The leadership of Arafat was very widely supported. He was supported by upwards of 80% of the Palestinian people. He was the one unifying national figure. And Israel wanted to divide the PLO and therefore fostered the rise of Hamas. I hope it goes without saying, certainly if you watch YouTube or watch any of these shows that we've all been talking about that I do, you'll know that I'm wholly opposed to religious extremism of any kind, whether Christian fundamentalist or Islamist fundamentalist or Jewish fundamentalist. I'm against extremism in religion as I am against extremism in politics as a whole. Though, just like Israel was responsible for the development of Hamas, the West has been responsible for an ever more toxic series of twists to Islamist extremism. Even Mr. Blair acknowledged in the last day or two that our policy towards Iraq, for example, funny that didn't come up tonight, by the way. Yeah? What about dealing with something on which I'm arguably right? The policy of the West, buttressing of Arab dictatorships, endless support for Israel, invading and occupying Muslim countries, filling the air with Islamophobic propaganda and so on. These have all been recruiting sergeants. You said in your introduction that in 2001 I was awarded the Spectator Parliamentary Debater of the Year award, and the speeches for which I was given that award were all in 2001, 14 years ago, arguing that this would happen, that if we handled the bin Laden-inspired atrocity on 9/11 in the wrong way, we would see thousands of bin Ladens develop. In fact, it's been hundreds of thousands, if not millions. So I'm against Islamist extremism. I believe we should defeat its terrorist form in the form of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We have no alternative but to defeat it. We cannot negotiate with it. We have to defeat it on the battlefield. And we should support anyone who is defeating it on the battlefield. But that's a necessary but not sufficient response. It is necessary, but it is not sufficient. Because if having defeated extremist Islamism on the battlefield, we think that we can allow the status quo ante to prevail, then we'll merely be postponing the day when this phenomenon will rise up again. So we need to defeat it on the battlefield, and we need revolutionary political change in the Muslim countries.
Thank you. We have time for one very short question. Yes, in the front.
Julian Sutcliffe, Peterhouse. If what you believe, well, clearly you do believe that what this country desires, what this country in fact needs is conviction politics and people who speak the truth and mean what they say, and it's undeniable that that is what you do. But if that is what you do, why is it the case the country has not seen fit, well, your constituency has not seen fit to support you and re-elect you?
But I've been elected 6 times to the House of Commons, twice as a respect Member of Parliament, in rock solid Labour seats. And I'm running for Mayor of London, and I'm doing quite well, I promise you. So let's postpone that question until next May, shall we?
Fantastic. Well, unfortunately, we're now out of time, and we actually have another speaker event at 7. Thank you so much for coming all the way to Cambridge to address this union. As you probably know, this is our 200th anniversary year, so it is a pleasure to have you here as part of these celebrations, and I really hope you found the discussion engaging. And I want, on behalf of everyone here, I'd like to thank you for coming all the way to Cambridge and for speaking at the union.
Thank you. Thank you very much.